The red dust swirled around Mike Chen's boots as he trudged across the Mojave Desert scrapyard. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, causing sweat to trickle down his neck. He paused, wiping his brow with a bandana, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette that had drawn him to this forgotten corner of Earth. "You sure you want that old thing?" called out the yard owner, a weathered man named Frank who'd seen everything from military helicopters to experimental aircraft pass through his hands. "NASA surplus ain't what it used to be." Mike nodded, his heart racing with anticipation. "I've been saving for this my whole life." What stood before him wasn't just any decommissioned spacecraft. It was a prototype Mars lander, one of the test vehicles built during the ambitious Ares program that had been scrapped when budget cuts hit the space agency 5 years ago. The craft's once gleaming hull was now dulled by desert exposure, its landing struts partially buried in sand, but to Mike, it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. 30,000, cash, Mike said, hefting a duffel bag. "Just like we agreed." Frank chuckled, taking the bag with calloused hands. "Your funeral, buddy. Engine's still good, but the NAV system's shot. You'll never get this bird off the ground." Mike smiled knowingly. What Frank didn't understand was that Mike wasn't just some space enthusiast with more money than sense. He was an aerospace engineer who'd spent the last 3 years of his life working nights and weekends on a revolutionary propulsion system. A system that could, theoretically, make this forgotten piece of space history fly again. "I'll take my chances," Mike replied. 2 months later, under the cover of night, Mike stood in his remote workshop, a converted airplane hangar miles from the nearest neighbor. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he ran the final diagnostic checks. His modified navigation system glowed with a soft blue light, displaying readouts that would have made his former NASA colleagues raise their eyebrows in disbelief. "Systems nominal," he whispered to himself, a ritual from his days as a mission control operator. "Guidance online. Propulsion ready." This wasn't just about fulfilling a childhood dream anymore. 3 weeks ago, while replacing the lander's environmental control system, Mike had discovered something impossible, a hidden compartment sealed with technology unlike anything he'd ever encountered. The metal had no visible seams, no screws or welds, yet it had opened at his touch like it had been waiting for him. Inside, he'd found strange crystalline components that seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't identify. He'd integrated them into his design, and the results had exceeded his wildest expectations. The craft's power efficiency had increased tenfold. What Mike didn't know was that tonight's test flight would change everything, not just for him, but potentially for all of humanity. As the hangar roof retracted, revealing a canvas of stars, Mike settled into the pilot's seat. His hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, muscle memory from countless simulations guiding his movements. "Ignition sequence initiated," he murmured, feeling the craft come alive beneath him. The modified engines roared with surprising quietness, more of a deep vibration than a sound. Blue-green energy pulsed through conduits that hadn't been part of the original design. The spacecraft lifted effortlessly, hovering 10 feet off the ground. Mike laughed in disbelief. It was working. His calculations had been correct, but then something unexpected happened. The crystalline components began to glow with increasing intensity. The navigation screen flickered, displaying symbols he didn't recognize. The craft shot upward with sudden acceleration that pressed Mike back into his seat with crushing force. "System override," he gasped, fighting to reach the manual controls. But it was too late. Within minutes, Earth was a shrinking blue marble beneath him. The stars streaked by at impossible speeds as the craft entered what could only be described as a wormhole, a tunnel of swirling light cutting through the fabric of space itself. When the journey ended and the crushing G-forces subsided, Mike opened his eyes to see the unmistakable rusty landscape of Mars filling his view screen. But this Mars was different. Not the barren wasteland from NASA's photographs, but a planet with strange structures visible on its surface. The craft landed automatically, settling onto Martian soil with a gentle thud. As systems powered down around him, Mike heard a soft humming coming from the same hidden compartment where he'd found the crystals. With trembling hands, he approached it. This time, the compartment opened to reveal a glowing stasis pod. Inside was what appeared to be a woman, but with iridescent skin that shifted colors like an opal and eyes that opened to reveal galaxies. "At last," she said in perfect English, her voice resonating directly in his mind. "The air returns." Mike stumbled backward, his reality shattering around him. What are you?" he managed to ask. She stepped gracefully from the pod, her movements fluid as water. "I am Lyra, last princess of the Martian High Council." "And you, Michael Chin, are the descendant of our ambassador to Earth, sent there 10,000 years ago." She touched his forehead gently, and memories that weren't his own flooded his consciousness. A thriving Martian civilization, a catastrophic war, a desperate plan to preserve their legacy through human bloodlines. "Your blood awakened the ship," she continued. "And now you must help me save what remains of my people before they are lost forever." Outside the spacecraft's viewport, lights began to appear across the Martian landscape, structures rising from beneath the red sand like ancient sentinels awakening from slumber. Mike realized with sudden clarity that his impulse purchase hadn't been chance at all. Something had been calling him to that desert scrapyard, something in his very DNA, and now he faced an impossible choice: return to Earth and the life he knew, or embrace a destiny among the stars that he never could have imagined. Mike stared at Lyra, his mind reeling with impossible revelations. The spacecraft's interior lights cast a soft glow on her features, highlighting the subtle shimmer of her skin as it shifted between hues of blue and violet. Outside, the Martian landscape continued to transform as more structures emerged from beneath centuries of dust. "This can't be happening," Mike whispered, gripping the edge of the control panel to steady himself. "Mars is dead. We've sent rovers, orbiters. There's nothing but rocks and frozen water." Lyra's expression softened. "What your people call Mars is merely the shell of what once was. We moved our civilization beneath the surface when the solar radiation intensified thousands of years ago." She gestured toward the viewscreen. "What you're seeing now is only a fraction of what exists below." Mike watched as spires continued to rise from the red soil, elegant structures that seemed to be made of the same crystalline material HFY found in the spacecraft. They caught the dim Martian sunlight and refracted it into prismatic patterns across the landscape. "But why me?" he asked, unable to tear his gaze away from the unfolding miracle outside. "There are billions of people on Earth." "Not just anyone could activate the beacons," Lyra explained, moving to a control panel he hadn't noticed before. Her fingers danced across symbols that rearranged themselves at her touch. "The genetic markers are specific. Our ambassador interbred with early humans, creating a lineage that would one day be able to re-establish contact." A holographic display appeared between them, showing a DNA strand with certain sections highlighted in pulsing red light. "Your ancestors carried our knowledge forward, passing it down through generations. Some became great minds in your history, architects of pyramids, designers of astronomical observatories, pioneers in mathematics and physics. Others lived quiet lives, their blood carrying our legacy without their knowledge." The hologram shifted to show famous structures from Earth's ancient civilizations, alongside equations and astronomical charts that looked surprisingly modern. "So all those conspiracy theories about aliens helping build the pyramids?" Mike began. "Not aliens," Lyra corrected gently. "Your own relatives, carrying fragments of Martian knowledge in their DNA." Mike rubbed his temples, overwhelmed. Part of him wanted to dismiss this as an elaborate hallucination, but the evidence surrounded him: the impossible journey, the structures rising outside, and most convincingly, the strange familiarity he felt with the technology at his fingertips. NASA never found anything because they weren't looking in the right places, Mike realized aloud. Or with the right frequencies. Lyra nodded approvingly. "Our technology operates on principles your science has only begun to theorize about. What you call quantum entanglement is merely the surface of how we manipulate matter and energy." She moved to a wall that shimmered and became transparent, revealing a chamber filled with what looked like suspended animation pods. Inside each, Mike could make out shadowy figures. "The last of the High Council," Lyra explained, her voice tinged with sadness. 200 survivors from a civilization that once numbered in the millions. They've slept for over 1,000 Earth years, waiting for the beacon to be activated. And I triggered it by buying that spacecraft and installing the crystals, Mike said, pieces falling into place. The spacecraft recognized your genetic signature when you touched the sealed compartment. It was programmed to bring you here when the time was right. Mike's thoughts turned to Earth, to his small apartment, his job at the aerospace startup where his ideas were always considered too radical, the few friends who tolerated his obsession with space. Nothing there had ever felt quite right, as if he'd been living his life slightly out of phase with everyone else. What happens now? He asked, surprising himself with his calm acceptance. Now I need your help, Lyra said, her eyes intensifying to a deep cobalt blue. The systems sustaining my people are failing. That's why I was awakened first, to find the air and bring them back. Without new energy sources, the remaining Martians will die within 1 Earth month. She moved closer, her proximity sending an electric sensation across Mike's skin. But there's more at stake than just my people. The same environmental catastrophe that forced us underground is beginning to affect Earth. Your polar ice caps melting, your weather patterns changing, these are not just the result of human activity. A new hologram appeared, showing solar radiation patterns across the inner planets. Certain waves were highlighted, pulsing with increasing intensity as the simulation progressed through time. The Sun is entering a new phase of activity, one that occurs every 50,000 years. Last time, it nearly wiped us out. This time, Earth stands directly in its path. Mike felt a chill run through him. Are you saying Earth is about to face what Mars did thousands of years ago? Yes, Lyra confirmed grimly. But we developed technology that could have saved our surface world if we'd had more time to implement it. That knowledge is stored in the collective memory of the High Council. She gestured to the sleeping figures. If we can revive them and rebuild our energy systems, we might be able to save both worlds. Mike looked back at the spacecraft that had brought him here, understanding now that it was more than a decommissioned NASA prototype. It was a vessel designed to bridge 2 worlds, 2 bloodlines, 2 potential futures. There's something you're not telling me, he said, recognizing the hesitation in Lyra's stance. What's the catch? Lyra's gaze dropped momentarily, then rose to meet his with renewed intensity. The process of awakening the Council requires a genetic key, a fusion of Martian and Earth DNA that can only be created through a bonding ceremony. In your terms, we would need to marry. Mike's mouth went dry. Marry? But we just met. Our concept is different from yours, Lyra explained. It's not about emotion but genetic compatibility. The ceremony creates a biological link that will allow you to access the full spectrum of your Martian heritage. She paused. Though traditionally, the emotional connection often follows. As if on cue, the ground beneath them trembled. Dust cascaded from the ceiling of the chamber. We don't have much time, Lyra said urgently. The awakening of our systems has triggered seismic instability. Soon, NASA's satellites will detect the activity, and they'll send missions to investigate. Mike stood at the precipice of a decision that would alter not just his life, but potentially the future of 2 worlds. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about human history, about Earth's place in the cosmos, had been appended in a matter of hours, and now he was being asked to marry an alien princess to save 2 planets. Another tremor shook the chamber, stronger than the last. Dust and small fragments of crystal rained down from above. One of the stasis pods flickered, its occupant stirring slightly before falling still again. We need to make a decision, Lyra urged, steadying herself against a control panel. Every moment we delay puts both our worlds at greater risk. Mike paced the chamber, running his hands through his hair. This is insane. Yesterday I was an engineer with a crazy hobby. Today I'm supposedly part alien, standing on Mars, being asked to marry someone I just met to save 2 planets. He laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. How do I even know any of this is real? Maybe those crystals I installed released some kind of hallucinogenic gas. Lyra's eyes flashed with frustration. You think this is a hallucination? She grabbed his hand and pressed it against the wall. Under his touch, the material became transparent, revealing the vast underground city that sprawled beneath them. Thousands of structures connected by crystalline bridges stretched for miles, illuminated by a soft blue glow. At the center stood a massive dome filled with what appeared to be a forest, plants unlike anything on Earth, with silver-blue leaves that pulsed with light. "That's the last of our oxygen production facility," Lyra explained. "It's failing. In 28 Earth days, it will collapse entirely." Mike pulled his hand away, overwhelmed by the scale of what he was seeing. "Even if I believe you, and I'm not saying I do, how would this genetic bonding ceremony even work? I'm human, mostly human anyway." "The ceremony activates dormant sequences in your DNA," Lyra explained, moving to a circular platform at the center of the room. She waved her hand, and a holographic display appeared, showing 2 DNA strands merging and reconfiguring. "Your Martian heritage is there, but dormant. The ceremony awakens it, creating a bridge between our genetic codes." Another tremor, more violent than before, sent them both stumbling. Warning lights flashed across the control panels. "The awakening process is gaining momentum," Lyra said urgently. "Without proper guidance, the automated systems will continue bringing dormant technology online in random sequences. It could tear the planet apart." Mike's mind raced. If even half of what Lyra was saying was true, the stakes were unimaginable. But something still didn't add up. "If my DNA is so important, why didn't your people contact Earth sooner? Why wait until now when everything's falling apart?" Lyra's expression darkened. "We tried many times over the centuries. Some of your so-called UFO sightings were our attempts to establish contact. But each time, the genetic signatures were too weak, the potential candidates unable to fully activate the technology." She hesitated. "And there were complications." "What kind of complications?" Mike pressed. Before Lyra could answer, an alarm blared through the chamber. One of the walls transformed into a view screen showing the Martian surface. A red dot was moving across the screen, approaching their location. "What's that?" Mike asked, already guessing the answer. "An Earth orbital probe," Lyra confirmed. "It's changed course to investigate the energy signatures from our awakening systems." She turned to face him, her eyes now a deep, urgent purple. "We're out of time. Your people will discover us within hours." Mike froze, suddenly understanding the implications. If NASA detected signs of alien technology, of an entire civilization, what would happen? Military involvement? Panic? An international scramble to claim the discovery. "I need to send a message to Earth," he said suddenly, "to explain what's happening before they jump to conclusions." "Impossible," Lyra replied. "Any transmission we send would be intercepted by your military first. They wouldn't believe you, they'd assume you were under duress or compromised." Another violent shake rocked the chamber. This time, one of the stasis pod's power levels dropped critically. The figure inside began to move more actively, clearly in distress. "That's the chief scientist," Lyra gasped, rushing to the pod. "He's awakening prematurely. Without the proper sequence, his body will reject reanimation." She looked back at Mike, desperation in her eyes. "He holds the complete knowledge of the solar shield technology. If he dies, any hope of protecting Earth dies with him." Mike watched as the figure in the pod thrashed weakly, the life support systems failing around him. The decision was crystallizing in his mind, not from some mystical alien connection, but from the very human instinct to prevent suffering when it was within his power to do so. "What do I need to do?" he asked quietly, relief washed over Lyra's face. "Come with me." She led him through a doorway that appeared in the wall, into a chamber that seemed to be made entirely of light. At its center stood a platform surrounded by hovering crystals, each pulsing with a different color. "The bonding chamber," Lyra explained. "Once active for royal ceremonies, now repurposed for survival." Mike stepped onto the platform beside her, his heart pounding. "So we just, what? Say, I do in Martian?" Despite the gravity of the situation, Lyra's lips curved into a small smile. "Not quite." She took his hands in hers. "The ceremony is physical, not verbal. Our genetic material must merge willingly. Mike swallowed hard. That sounds, not as you imagine, Lyra assured him quickly. It requires only blood, a small sample from each of us, freely given. She pressed a finger to the center of the platform, and a small crystal needle emerged. Without hesitation, she pressed her palm against it, wincing slightly as it pierced her skin. A drop of her blood, iridescent and shifting like her skin, fell onto the platform's surface. The needle retracted and then reappeared, clean and waiting. Mike stared at it, his mind racing through everything that had led him to this moment. The inexplicable pull he'd felt toward that abandoned spacecraft in the desert. The strange familiarity of the technology. The dreams he'd had since childhood of a red world waiting for him. Another violent tremor shook the chamber. From the other room, he could hear the warning sounds of the failing stasis pod growing more urgent. "This is crazy," he muttered, but extended his hand nonetheless as the needle pierced his skin. A drop of his blood, ordinary red human blood, fell next to Lyra's on the platform. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the two droplets began to move toward each other, as if pulled by an invisible force. When they touched, a blinding light erupted from the platform. The crystals surrounding them began to spin, creating a vortex of color and energy. Mike felt a burning sensation spread from his hand throughout his body, like electricity flowing through every cell. Memories that weren't his own flooded his consciousness. The glory of ancient Mars, great cities under a sky still blue, scientific achievements beyond anything humanity had dreamed of. He saw the catastrophe that drove them underground, the desperate plan to preserve their legacy through Earth, the centuries of waiting. Somewhere distant, he heard Lyra gasp. She was experiencing his memories in return, his childhood fascination with space, his frustration at NASA's bureaucracy, his lonely work in the hangar, driven by a purpose he couldn't name. The light intensified until Mike had to close his eyes against the glare. When he opened them again, the world looked different. Colors he had no names for existed at the edges of his vision. Information seemed to flow from every surface, readable as easily as breathing. "It's done," Lyra whispered, her voice somehow both outside and inside his mind. "The bond is complete." Mike looked down at his hands, expecting them to look different. They appeared unchanged, but when he concentrated, he could see a subtle shimmer beneath the skin. A trace of the same iridescence that characterized Lyra. A deafening alarm cut through the moment. The entire complex shuddered violently. "What's happening now?" Mike shouted over the noise. Lyra's eyes widened with fear. "Multiple systems are activating at the defense grid, the atmospheric processors, they're all coming online without proper synchronization." She grabbed his arm. "We need to get to the central control chamber immediately." They rushed back to the main room, where the situation with the stasis pods had deteriorated further. 3 were now flashing critical warnings. On the view screen, the red dot representing Earth's probe had changed course again. It was now descending toward the Martian surface directly above them. "They've detected us," Lyra said grimly. "And the defense system is registering them as a threat." Mike watched in horror as a targeting system activated on the screen, locking onto the descending probe. "No," he shouted. "Those are my people. You can't shoot them down." "I'm not controlling it," Lyra said desperately. "The automated systems are acting on 1,000-year-old protocols. We need to reach the control center to override them." Another violent quake knocked them both to the floor. When Mike looked up, he saw cracks forming in the ceiling. Through them, he could see the red Martian sky, and a small, glinting object descending rapidly. "It's not just a probe," he realized with growing dread. "That's a manned mission. NASA must have had it in orbit waiting." Lyra's face paled. If they land while the defense systems are active? She didn't need to finish the thought. The first contact between Earth and Mars would be a disaster. Humans shot down by automated weapons, Martian survivors dying as their life support failed, 2 civilizations losing their chance at salvation before it even began. The crystal floor beneath them began to pulse with increasing intensity. Mike felt a strange sensation, knowledge pouring into his consciousness, as if the bond with Lyra had opened a channel to the planet itself. I know what we need to do, he said suddenly, the words feeling foreign yet right in his mouth. But we have about 30 seconds to do it. The targeting system on the screen beeped its final lock. The incoming craft was seconds away from being fired upon. Above them, through the cracked ceiling, the Earth vessel's heat shield glowed orange as it hit the thin Martian atmosphere. Behind them, the stasis pod containing the chief scientist flatlined. Time seemed to slow as Mike's newly enhanced consciousness processed everything at once. The targeting system counting down, the NASA craft descending, the dying Martian scientist, the trembling facility around them, all pieces of a puzzle he suddenly understood. The central control chamber isn't where you think it is, Mike said, grabbing Lyra's arm. His voice sounded different even to his own ears, resonating with newfound authority. It's in the spacecraft that brought me here. Lyra's eyes widened. That's impossible. The control systems have always been hidden in plain sight, Mike finished. A failsafe your ancestors built in case the main facility was compromised. The ship isn't just transportation, it's a backup command center. Another violent tremor sent chunks of crystal crashing down around them. Mike pulled Lyra toward the exit, navigating with a certainty he couldn't explain. Knowledge flowed through him like electricity through a circuit, blueprints, access codes, emergency protocols. We have 15 seconds before the defense system fires, he shouted as they raced through collapsing corridors. The ground buckled beneath their feet, forcing them to leap across widening fissures in the floor. They burst onto the Martian surface, the thin atmosphere burning Mike's lungs despite his newly enhanced physiology. The spacecraft sat 50 yards away, its hull gleaming under the alien sun as if it had been waiting for this moment. Mike glanced up at the sky. The NASA craft was now clearly visible, its heat shield glowing as it descended. The targeting system would fire in seconds. They sprinted across the red soil, each step kicking up dust that hung suspended in the low gravity. As they reached the spacecraft, Mike pressed his palm against the hull, not where the door had been before, but in a seemingly random spot near the propulsion system. The hull rippled like water, creating an opening. They tumbled inside, into a chamber that hadn't existed during Mike's journey to Mars. The walls pulsed with the same crystalline technology he'd seen throughout the underground facility. 7 seconds, Lyra gasped as the door sealed behind them. Mike moved with certainty to a console at the center of the room. His hands danced across symbols that would have been incomprehensible to him hours ago but now made perfect sense. Emergency override, authorization genetic prime, he said, the Martian words feeling strange yet natural on his tongue. The countdown froze at 3 seconds. The targeting system powered down. Lyra collapsed against a wall in relief. You did it. But Mike wasn't celebrating. That was just the first problem. He pointed to another display showing the underground facility. The containment systems are failing throughout the complex. We have minutes before a cascade failure releases radiation that will sterilize everything within 10 miles. The sleeping council members, Lyra whispered in horror. We need to transfer them here, Mike said, already working the controls. This ship was designed as an ark in case of emergency. The floor beneath them shifted, revealing a large empty chamber. The stasis pods can be remotely teleported into this hold, Mike explained, but the system requires both of us to authorize it. Lyra joined him at the console, their hands moving in sync across the controls. On the display, the stasis pods began to shimmer and disappear from the facility, reappearing moments later in the hold beneath them. 198 transferred, Lyra announced. 2 failed to initialize. Mike grimaced. The chief scientist was one of them, wasn't he? Lyra nodded grimly. And the defense minister. The 2 most critical council members for implementing the solar shield technology. A new alarm blared through the ship. On the external display, the NASA craft had landed less than a mile away. A hatch was opening. We've got company, Mike muttered, but before either of them could react, another alert demanded their attention. A secondary display activated, showing a massive solar flare erupting from the sun, headed directly toward Mars and Earth. That's not possible, Lyra breathed, her face pale. The solar cycle shouldn't peak for another 18 months. Mike studied the readings. It's not natural, he realized with growing dread. The activation of the Martian systems has created a gravitational anomaly. It's disrupting the sun's magnetic field. We've triggered it early, Lyra whispered. The very catastrophe we were trying to prevent. The implications were staggering. Without the knowledge lost with the chief scientist, they couldn't implement the solar shield. Billions would die on Earth within days as the radiation bombarded the planet. Mars, already a largely dead world, would lose what little remained of its protective atmospheric layer. The display tracking the NASA craft showed figures in SPAC suits emerging onto the Martian surface. They were carrying scientific equipment and weapons. They think we're hostile, Mike said, watching the cautious way the astronauts moved. After the energy signatures and seismic activity, they're treating this as a potential threat. Lyra turned to him, her eyes reflecting the emergency lights. What do? We can't operate the shield technology without the chief scientist's knowledge. We have hostile humans approaching, and we have 198 council members in suspended animation who are our responsibility. Mike was about to respond when yet another alert sounded, different from the others. A proximity warning. Something's coming, he said, checking the sensors. Something big from below the surface. The ground around them began to tremble again, but differently than before. This was rhythmic, almost like footsteps. The sensors showed a massive object rising through the layers of Martian crust, heading straight for the surface. That's impossible, Lyra said, staring at the readings. All the Guardians were decommissioned millennia ago. Guardians? Mike asked. Before Lyra could answer, the object broke through to the surface less than a quarter mile away. Red dust exploded outward as something massive emerged from beneath the ground that Mike's jaw dropped. Standing before them was what could only be described as a colossal robot, a towering humanoid figure at least 100 feet tall, constructed of the same crystalline material as the Martian technology but augmented with what appeared to be armor plating. Its eyes glowed with intense blue energy as it surveyed its surroundings. The last Guardian, Lyra whispered in awe. They were our defenders during the final wars, before we went underground. They were all supposed to have been shut down. The Guardian turned its massive head toward the NASA landing craft. The astronauts had frozen in place, weapons raised uselessly against the towering figure. It's going to attack them, Mike realized with horror. It's identifying them as invaders. He frantically worked the controls, trying to find an override command, but nothing responded. I can't stop it. This system doesn't have authority over the Guardian protocols. The massive robot began to move toward the human landing party, each step shaking the ground. The astronauts scattered, firing weapons that simply bounced off the Guardian's crystalline hide. There's something wrong with its behavior, Lyra said, studying the readings. It's not following standard Guardian protocols. Look at these energy signatures. They're erratic, almost what? Mike demanded that Lyra's face drained of color. Almost as if someone else is controlling it. At that moment, a new hologram appeared in the center of the command chamber, the figure of an elderly Martian man. His iridescent skin faded to a pale blue, his eyes hard as diamonds. The defense minister, Lyra gasped. But how? His stasis pod failed. The hologram smiled coldly. Did it? Or did I simply want you to believe it had? Understanding dawned on Lyra's face. You sabotaged the chief scientist's pod. A necessary sacrifice, the hologram replied dismissively. Asta was weak. He would have insisted on saving both worlds. The defense minister's gaze shifted to Mike. You should never have been found, half-breed. The genetic line was supposed to end centuries ago. Mike felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. What are you talking about? Your existence was an unfortunate accident, the minister continued. When we realized what the rising solar activity would do, the council was divided. Some, like Lyra's parents, wanted to contact Earth to save both our worlds. His expression hardened. Others of us understood the truth, that there was only enough resources to save one planet. And it should be ours. You're insane, Mike said. You've been in stasis for 1,000 years. Mars is barely habitable even below ground. Earth is a thriving world with billions of people. Precisely, the minister replied coldly. Billions of primitive creatures who destroyed their own ecosystem in mere centuries. They don't deserve to survive. We are the superior civilization. Outside, the Guardian had reached the NASA craft. It raised a massive crystalline fist above it. Stop this! Mike shouted. Those are innocent people. The minister's hologram flickered with what might have been amusement. Their presence is convenient. When Earth detects that their mission has been destroyed, they will send more ships, military vessels. And when those are destroyed as well, they will assume Mars harbors hostile life and launch everything they have against us. Lyra's eyes widened in horror. You want a war? I want extinction, the minister corrected. Earth will exhaust its nuclear arsenal against our defenses, leaving them completely vulnerable when the solar flare hits. Meanwhile, I will use the ancient weapon systems to shield Mars just enough for our people to survive. Mike looked at Lyra, desperation in his eyes. How do we stop the Guardian? Lyra's gaze moved from Mike to the minister's hologram, her mind racing. There's only one way, she said quietly. The genetic prime override. The minister laughed. Impossible. That would require the royal bloodline, and Princess Lyra here is the last of her line. Unless. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Mike. The bonding couldn't have succeeded. It's never worked with Earth genetics before. Mike felt something stirring within him, a power he didn't understand but somehow knew how to use. He grabbed Lyra's hand, and together they stepped toward the hologram. You forgot something, Minister, Lyra said, her voice steady. The royal bloodline doesn't end with me anymore. The minister's hologram flickered with sudden uncertainty. Guards, he shouted, but it was too late. Mike and Lyra spoke in unison, their voices resonating with power that seemed to vibrate through the very molecules of the air. Guardian Protocol Alpha Prime. Royal Override. Stand down. Outside, the massive robot froze, its fists suspended in midair above the terrified astronauts. Its glowing eyes flickered, then changed from menacing red to a calm blue. The minister's hologram contorted with rage. This changes nothing. The solar flare is still coming, and without the chief scientist, you cannot activate the shield network. You've bought Earth mere days at most. As the hologram faded, Mike turned to Lyra, an impossible idea forming in his mind. What if we don't need the chief scientist's knowledge? He asked. What if it's already here? He tapped his temple. The genetic bonding didn't just connect us to each other. It connected us to something bigger, to the entire history of both our peoples. Lyra's eyes widened with understanding. The ancestral memory. It's been part of the royal genetic line for generations, but it was considered a myth, a spiritual concept rather than literal knowledge. It's real, Mike insisted. When we bonded, I saw flashes of Mars as it was thousands of years ago. What if the chief scientist's knowledge isn't gone? If it's preserved in the collective memory we can access? Hope dawned on Lyra's face. It's possible, but accessing ancestral memory at that level would require both of us, Mike finished. Working together in perfect sync. Outside, the NASA astronauts were cautiously approaching the now-dormant Guardian, their weapons still raised. On another screen, the solar flare continued its deadly journey toward the inner planets. We have one chance, Mike said, looking from the approaching humans to the deadly solar storm. And we need to take it now. Little did he know that the defense minister's plan had only begun to unfold, and the true nature of the ancient Martian technology was far more terrifying than anything he could imagine. Mike and Lyra stood before the ship's central console, hands intertwined, eyes closed in concentration. Around them, the command chamber hummed with energy as the craft's systems responded to their combined genetic signature. Focus on the shield technology, Lyra whispered. Picture it in your mind. Let the ancestral memory guide you. Mike took a deep breath, pushing away the chaos surrounding them, the NASA astronauts cautiously approaching, the dormant Guardian towering over the landscape, the solar flare racing toward them with deadly intent. He turned his thoughts inward, seeking the fragments of memory that didn't belong to him. First, There was nothing but darkness. Then, like stars appearing in a night sky, pinpoints of light began to form connections. Images flashed through his consciousness, ancient Martian scientists working on massive crystalline arrays, complex equations written in a language he somehow understood, the triumphant activation of a planetary shield during a previous solar event. "I see it," Mike murmured, his eyes still closed. "The shield matrix. It's beautiful." Beside him, Lyra gasped. "I see it too. Through you." Their minds merged deeper, navigating the labyrinth of ancestral memory. The knowledge of the chief scientist unfolded before them, complex yet suddenly comprehensible. It wasn't just a shield, it was a solar energy conversion system designed to transform the deadly radiation into sustainable power. "We need to activate the primary nodes," Mike said, his fingers moving across the console with unexpected precision. 3 on Mars, 3 on Earth. Lyra's hands joined his, completing the sequences he initiated. The Earth nodes were placed there thousands of years ago, disguised as ancient monuments. On the display, 3 points illuminated across the Martian surface, one at the North Pole, one near Olympus Mons, and one directly beneath their position. Simultaneously, 3 corresponding points appeared on the Earth map: Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid of Giza, and a location deep in the Amazon rainforest. That's why they were built, Mike realized in awe. Not just as astronomical markers, but as components of a planet-wide defense system. A warning flashed across the screen. The defense minister had locked them out of the primary activation sequence. "He's trying to prevent us from extending the shield to Earth," Lyra said urgently. "We need to bypass his command codes." Mike's newly enhanced mind raced through possibilities. "We don't need to bypass them. We can rewrite them." His hands flew across the controls, inputting sequences faster than humanly possible. The royal genetic key doesn't just give us access, it gives us authority to reprogram the entire system. Outside, the NASA astronauts had reached the foot of the dormant Guardian, their scientific instruments scanning its crystalline structure. One of them noticed the spacecraft and began moving cautiously toward it, signaling the others to follow. "We've got company," Mike warned, glancing at the external cameras. 5 minutes until they reach us. And 12 minutes until the solar flare hits Mars," Lyra added grimly. "Earth will be hit 17 minutes after that." The console beneath their hands suddenly flashed red. The defense minister's face appeared on the screen, his expression contorted with fury. "Override rejected," he snarled. "You've forgotten something, princess. The royal authority requires unanimous council approval during a crisis. And I still control half the council." The stasis pods in the hold below began to activate. The surviving council members were waking up, directly under the minister's influence. "He's using their genetic signatures to counter our commands," Lyra realized with horror. "As long as they support him, we're deadlocked." Mike's mind raced. "Then we need to break the deadlock. We need to show them the truth." He turned to Lyra. "Can you establish a mental link with the council members? Show them what we've learned about the minister's plan." Lyra hesitated. "It's possible but dangerous. A link that broad could overwhelm our minds, especially yours. Your Martian abilities are newly awakened, you're not accustomed to the neural load." "We don't have a choice," Mike insisted. "It's this or watch both our worlds burn." Lyra nodded reluctantly. They positioned themselves in the center of the command chamber, kneeling face to face, hands clasped. "Look into my eyes," Lyra instructed. "Focus only on me. When the connection starts, don't fight it. Let it flow through you." Their foreheads touched. Mike felt a spark of energy, then a rushing sensation like falling through space. Suddenly, his consciousness expanded, not just to Lyra, but to dozens of other minds. The awakening council members, confused and disoriented after centuries of stasis, through their combined perception, Mike and Lyra showed the council everything: the defense minister's treachery, the solar flare, the plan to sacrifice Earth, the knowledge gleaned from ancestral memory. Most importantly, they revealed the truth about the shield technology, that it could save both planets if deployed correctly. 1 by 1, The council members' minds shifted from confusion to understanding, then to resolve. Their genetic signatures began aligning with Mike and Lyra's command authority, overriding the defense minister's control. No, the minister's voice roared through the ship's communication system. You fools! There isn't enough power to shield both worlds. That's where you're wrong, Mike projected through the mental link, his voice reaching all of them. The shield doesn't just block the radiation, it harvests it. The more intense the solar flare, the more energy it generates. Enough to reinforce both planetary shields and revitalize Mars in the process. The defense minister's hologram appeared in the center of the command chamber, his form flickering with rage. You'll doom us all, half-breed. The system was never tested at full capacity. Then will be the test, Mike replied firmly. With the council now united behind them, Mike and Lyra initiated the activation sequence. The ship hummed with increasing power as it connected to the 3 Martian nodes on the display. The dormant Guardian suddenly straightened, its crystalline form glowing with blue energy. It wasn't attacking, it was transforming, its massive arms extending upward toward the sky, its chest opening to reveal a pulsing core of energy. It's part of the shield array, Lyra realized. The Guardians weren't just warriors, they were critical components of the planetary defense system. Across Mars, long-dormant machinery began to awaken. Massive crystalline spires rose from beneath the red soil, their tips glowing with building energy. The 3 primary nodes pulsed in sequence, creating a triangular pattern of light visible from orbit. On Earth, something equally remarkable was happening. The ancient monuments were activating, energy signatures detected by every scientific instrument on the planet. At Stonehenge, the stone circles glowed with blue light. At Giza, the pyramid's tip emitted a beam of energy straight into the sky. In the Amazon, a structure long hidden beneath vegetation revealed itself, rising from the Earth like its Martian counterparts. The NASA astronauts had reached the spacecraft, their expressions of awe visible even through their helmet visors. One of them, the mission commander, tentatively raised a hand in a universal gesture of peaceful contact. Mike made a decision. We need to bring them inside, he said to Lyra. They deserve to see what happens next. Lyra hesitated only briefly before nodding. Open the external hatch, she instructed the ship's systems as the astronauts cautiously entered the craft. Mike and Lyra completed the final activation sequence. The shield array was ready, the nodes on both planets aligned perfectly. All that remained was to channel the approaching solar flare. 30 seconds to impact, Lyra announced. The defense minister made a final, desperate attempt to stop them, his hologram lunging toward the console. You'll kill us all. No, Mike said firmly. We'll save everyone. With a gesture, he dismissed the minister's hologram and turned to face the NASA astronauts who now stood in the command chamber, their helmets removed, faces filled with confusion and wonder. Hold on to something, Mike advised them with a smile. This might get intense. The solar flare hit Mars with the force of 1,000 nuclear detonations. The planet's thin atmosphere would have been stripped away instantly, but the shield was in place. The Guardian and the other nodes absorbed the radiation, converting it to pure energy that flowed through the crystalline network. The spacecraft shuddered as waves of power surged through the Martian surface. Inside the command chamber, the air itself seemed to shimmer with charged particles. It's working! Lyra exclaimed, monitoring the displays. The shield is holding. The NASA astronauts watched in stunned silence as the view screen showed the solar flare being channeled, redirected, and transformed. What should have been planetary destruction was becoming planetary renewal. Energy conversion at 200% of projected capacity, Mike reported, his enhanced mind processing the data instantly, directing excess power to atmospheric processors. Above them, the thin Martian sky began to change. The shield wasn't just protecting the planet, it was beginning to heal it. Oxygen levels increased incrementally as the ancient atmospheric generators, powered by the converted solar energy, pumped out gases long absent from Mars. My God, whispered one of the astronauts, a woman with a patch identifying her as Dr. Chen. It's terraforming the planet. 17 minutes later, the solar flare reached Earth. Just as on Mars, the ancient monuments activated, creating a shield that absorbed and converted the deadly radiation. Power grids across the planet surged with unexpected energy, clean, renewable power generated by the shield's conversion process. When it was over, both planets had weathered the flare without catastrophic damage. More than that, Mars had taken the first small step toward becoming habitable again on its surface. In the command chamber, humans and Martians stood together, united in shared amazement at what they had accomplished. So, one of the astronauts finally said, breaking the silence, "I'm guessing this isn't a NASA spacecraft after all?" Mike laughed, the tension of the past hours finally breaking. "Let's just say it's been significantly modified." As the immediate crisis passed, the full implications of what had happened began to sink in. First contact between humans and Martians. The revelation of Earth's ancient connection to Mars. The beginning of Mars renewal. The defense minister in custody, awaiting the council's judgment. What happens now? Mike asked Lyra as they stood looking out at the Martian landscape, where the Guardian had returned to its dormant state. "Now," Lyra said, taking his hand, "we build a bridge between our worlds. Together." The NASA astronauts were already in communication with Earth, explaining the incredible situation. Initial shock and disbelief were giving way to cautious excitement. Plans for formal diplomatic contact were being hastily arranged as Mike oversaw the reunion of the Martian Council members. Something caught his attention on one of the secondary displays. A data pattern he didn't recognize, hidden deep in the Guardian's activation sequence. "What's this?" he murmured, enhancing the display. The pattern expanded, revealing a signal not originating from Mars or Earth, but from somewhere much farther away. Beyond the solar system entirely. Lyra joined him, her expression changing to one of concern as she recognized what they were seeing. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That's a communication protocol from the old empire." "The old empire?" Mike questioned. "I don't have any ancestral memory of that." Lyra's face had gone pale. "Because those memories were deliberately erased from our genetic record. The old empire is what we fled from thousands of years before we came to Mars. They were the reason we developed this technology in the first place." The signal pulsed again, stronger this time. The Guardian outside responded with a subtle shift in its crystalline structure. "We activated the shield," Lyra realized with growing horror. "We sent a beacon that can be seen across the galaxy." Mike understood the implication immediately. "We just told them where we are." One of the NASA computers began translating the alien signal, decoding it into a simple message that appeared on their screen. 5 words that changed everything once again. "We have found you. Coming." The astronauts, the council members, Mike and Lyra, all stood in stunned silence as the message repeated. The story of Earth and Mars, it seemed, was merely a prelude to a much larger tale, one that had begun in the stars and would now continue there. Mike squeezed Lyra's hand. "Well," he said with grim determination, "I guess we'd better start preparing." Around them, the ancient technology of 2 worlds hummed with renewed purpose, ready to face whatever came next from the depths of space. The Guardian outside stood sentinel, its crystalline eyes turned toward the stars, watching for the arrival of those who had once driven their ancestors across the galaxy. The adventure, it seemed, had only just begun. 3 months passed in a whirlwind of activity. What had begun with Mike's impulsive purchase of a decommissioned spacecraft had transformed into the most significant event in human history. The revelation of an ancient Martian civilization hiding beneath the red planet's surface had stunned Earth's population, dominating news cycles and reshaping humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. Mike stood on a newly constructed observation platform on the Martian surface, no longer needing a pressure suit to breathe the gradually thickening atmosphere. The shield technology, now permanently integrated into both planets' defense systems, continued its work of slowly terraforming Mars while providing Earth with a revolutionary clean energy source. "The UN delegation arrives tomorrow," Lyra said, joining him at the railing. Her iridescent skin shimmered in the sunlight that now felt just a bit warmer than before. "Are you ready for your speech?" Mike smiled wryly. "As ready as I'll ever be." Who would have thought a guy who couldn't even get NASA to look at his propulsion designs would end up addressing the United Nations as Earth's ambassador to Mars? Lyra took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. The genetic bond between them had deepened over the months, evolving from a pragmatic alliance into something much more personal. What had begun as necessity had blossomed into genuine partnership, then affection, and finally love. The defense minister's trial concludes today, Lyra said, changing the subject. The council is expected to announce their verdict this evening. Mike nodded soberly. I hope they show more mercy than he would have. The former defense minister had been found guilty of multiple crimes, including the murder of the chief scientist and conspiracy to commit genocide against Earth. Yet Mike had argued for clemency, suggesting the minister's skills would be better used in preparing for the potential arrival of the old empire. Below them, the first joint Earth-Mars settlement was taking shape. Prefabricated habitats from Earth stood alongside crystalline structures grown by Martian technology. Scientists, engineers, and diplomats from both worlds worked side by side, exchanging knowledge that would benefit both civilizations. Dr. Chen, the NASA astronaut who had been among the first humans to make contact, now led the Earth science team. She waved up at them from the central plaza before returning to her work on integrating Martian medical technology with human healthcare practices. Any updates on our deep space monitoring? Mike asked, turning back to Lyra. She shook her head. Nothing conclusive. The astronomers estimate it would take even the old empire's fastest ships at least 5 years to reach us from their last known location. We have time to prepare. In the 3 months since detecting the signal, both Earth and Mars had devoted significant resources to understanding the threat. Ancient Martian records, long sealed away, had been reopened, revealing the history that had been deliberately erased from their genetic memory. The old empire, a vast, technologically advanced civilization spanning multiple star systems, had once attempted to absorb Mars' predecessor civilization into their collective. When the Martians' ancestors had refused, choosing independence over submission, the Empire had responded with overwhelming force, driving them across the galaxy until they found refuge in the Sol system. Do you think we can stand against them? Mike asked, voicing the question that kept him awake at night. If they come in force? Lyra's eyes reflected the determination that had drawn him to her from their first meeting. Together, we have a chance. Separate, we would fall. That's why what we're building here matters so much. Mike nodded, understanding the truth of her words. The threat of the old empire had accomplished something remarkable. It had united two worlds that might otherwise have regarded each other with suspicion or hostility. The Guardian robot stood sentinel at the edge of the settlement, one of dozens now activated across the Martian surface. Reprogrammed and upgraded with both Earth and Martian technology, they formed the first line of defense should the old empire arrive sooner than expected. I got a message from Frank yesterday, Mike said with a smile, referring to the scrapyard owner who had sold him the spacecraft. He wants to know if I need any more NASA surplus. Says he's got a weird-looking satellite dish that might be right up my alley. Lyra laughed, the sound like crystal chimes in the thin Martian air. Tell him we'll take a look after the UN delegation leaves. Who knows what ancient technology might be hiding in his desert junkyard. As the twin moons of Mars rose on the horizon, Mike reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him here. From an overlooked engineer tinkering in a hangar to the pivot point between two civilizations facing a common threat. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges both immediate and distant, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. We should head back, Lyra said, giving his hand a gentle tug. The council is waiting for our input on the defensive perimeter designs. Before they turned to leave, Mike took one last look at the vast Martian landscape, transformed by the events of the past months yet still hauntingly beautiful in its alien majesty. Earth hung like a blue jewel in the darkening sky, a constant reminder of what they were fighting to protect. You know, Mike said thoughtfully, when I bought that spacecraft, I was just looking for a way to prove my theories were right. I never imagined I'd find an alien bride. Lyra finished with an amused smile, using the phrase that Earth's media had sensationalized in their earliest reports. A whole new world, Mike corrected, though he didn't contradict the first description. And a purpose bigger than myself. As they walked back toward the settlement hand in hand, human and Martian united in common cause, the stars above them seemed to shine a little brighter, some perhaps harboring watchful eyes from the old empire, others possibly holding future allies yet to be discovered. Whatever challenges lay ahead, one thing was certain. The story that had begun with a man buying a spaceship in a desert scrapyard had opened a new chapter in the history of two worlds. And together, Earth and Mars would face the future, ready to write the next pages of their shared destiny among the stars. The universe, it seemed, was full of surprises. And Mike Chen, once an ordinary engineer with extraordinary dreams, had only just begun to discover them.